We're on good roads, but you'll come up to these barns fairly quickly. However, we have large white signs with red arrows that will direct you to the barns. Probably remember this from prior tours. Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody today. We're coming out on this day of our barn tour with a forecast that's a little questionable. I would like to give thanks to the barn owners, to Bob Insmicker, who has done a wonderful job of selecting these barns, and to Chris and Mr. Smith for the excellent photography taken, to Greg for his write-ups and his presentation this morning, to the Conservancy's Barn Tour Committee for their long work and excellent presentation and getting all of this pulled together. And we thank the merchants, the vendors, and the sponsors who helped us financially pull this together. Today we have 8 barns. The Waldheim, which is just outside, the 6 that you will see basically heading out Wassergasse, and then the barn rooms at the Heller Homestead. A feature today at the homestead is a vendor who hand paints hex signs. She will be there from about 11 to 4. She'll be painting the signs, so you'll see the process. It's also available for hire in terms of if you want a sign painted on your barn. This is a person who does this.
Where is that?
It's at the Heller Homestead. It's right off of, off of Friedensville Road. We've all talked about the concerns of the roads and getting to the places. Because of the proximity of the barns, take your time, spend extra time at the barns because they're very close at hand as compared to prior tours where you may have had to travel 15 minutes to the barn, the next barn, that sort of thing. Here's what we're planning on. We're going to have Bob and Greg give you a presentation on the barns. Greg has a special situation that he'll announce at the end of his presentation. He has an offer that may be very interesting to all of you. You have, I'm sure, read the booklet and need no additional introduction on my part to Bob Insmicker. Bob?
Yeah.
Ready to take it away?
Yeah. Hey, I had fun finding these barns because I had a chance to proposition the farmer's wife and make sure that you would get the barns on the tour.
It's plural, Bob.
What?
The wives.
Wives.
Not the wife.
Okay. Anyway. So I'm going to talk about the Heller barn, our barn, and where its origins can be found. So turn off the lights, Russ, if you will. Thank you. Okay, here's our Heller barn as it looked in the 1940s. It's not a Pennsylvania barn. It's a barn in Pennsylvania, but it doesn't have a forebay. Instead, it has a pent roof. And that's kind of rare in upstate in this part of the county. You find them on farther south in Bucks County. But here's our Heller barn, which was built probably around 1790. Greg had the 3 reinstated. Sometime in the middle 1800s, the barn was enlarged by the addition of this large frame barn. This does have a true forebay. That's a true Pennsylvania barn. And we'll explain what that's doing there. But that was there in the 1940s. It was probably built in the 1850s. However, according to Lenny's eye, a tornado came through in 1890 and blew this one away. Completely gone. It's reported in a newspaper called the South Bethlehem Star, and they said the barn was ruined completely. So what you're seeing here is probably a rebuilt of the barn that was added to the original Heller barn, and that was added on sometime after the 1890s. Here's a picture of the same barn, and the pent roof, that little shelf that we saw, is gone. But you can still see the line of stone here where the roof was attached. That's called a water table. And that water table only goes this far, because here's the arch, which is the original wagon shed of the barn. Later on, they built they extended this pent roof onto the end. They filled in the wagon shed, put a stable door in it, and made a stable out of that barn. So they got rid of the wagon shed and added a stable. At the same time, they extended the pent roof to the end, and they had to add this little hole for the pent arm to hold up the pent roof. So this barn is going through some modifications. This is a true bank barn, because here's a little picture of the back end of the barn with the bank and the threshing floor door, the wagon doors. So it's a true bank barn, but it is not a Pennsylvania bank barn. It has some other origins which we're going to check into. Looking at it again, here we see the original barn, the extended pent roof, and the add-on Pennsylvania 4-bay bank barn, the one which was burned down or blown away and then later rebuilt. So where did the people come? The Hellers came. Where did they come from? They came out of the Palatinate in Germany about 1750. They came from this area right in here. Here's the Rhine River. And they came from the area in this part of the Palatinate, and the village called Federsheim. This picture was given to me by Ken Rainier. It's a picture of a medieval Palatinate village which is walled. And notice the open fields around the village have no buildings, because all the farm buildings and the farmers live in the village. And this open field was called an open field system. It goes back to medieval times, and the farmers lived in the village, and they had strips scattered all around the village, which they shared to equalize the quality of the land. In fact, if you go there today, you can find villages just like this. This is in the Palatinate. There's a farming village, and the open field system which has persisted until the present day. So this medieval field system is difficult to change and revise, and the farmers who live in this village have to find their fields scattered around the village. Maybe eventually that will be corrected. If you go into the village, you're going to find streets lined with houses and barns. That's a typical Germanic house, half-timbered construction, interior central chimney, and here's a little barn. It's a ground-level barn. Most of the barns in these villages were rather small. So the Hellers who came from this region would have seen this kind of architecture when they came to Pennsylvania. And that's what they would have been used to seeing. And most people who come in here tend to build what they knew about back home. Here's another example of a Germanic Palatinate farmstead with a small Germanic cottage, half-timbered. An interior chimney always designates a Germanic house from an end chimney, which would signify an English building. And here's our little ground barn, all one level, no bank, threshing floor doors, stable, and stable. That's typical of the barn that the Hellers would have seen in the Palatinate. And when they came here, we don't know what they did first. We know that he eventually built this large stone barn, but that was a second generation barn. Here's another example of a Palatinate street village. All the buildings line the street. Here's the door to the threshing floor and the wagons. Here's the door to the stable, and here are the houses lined up, streetwise. There are no barnyards here. There's no room, so the cattle were taken out of the barn in the morning and taken to local open fields, which they shared. So again, the scene was totally different. When they came to Pennsylvania, William Penn had founded Philadelphia. He had his geographer, Thomas Home, go there in the 1780s and map this entire region, the southern part of Chester and Bucks County, between the Brandywine Creek and the Neshaminy Creek. So these lines were surveyed so that his people could come, and they were English Quakers. He was finding a homeland for them. Of course, also coming along after about 1710 were many people out of German Palatinate, which we just looked at. So they all came into Philadelphia and they settled this region. The English tended to settle in the south, and the Germans moved north up the river, up the Perkiomen, and into this area where we're sitting today. In fact, they took an old Indian trail called the Mincy Trail, which went from Philadelphia, Germantown. It came through Appleboxville, southwest Lytheville, into the Saucon Valley, right here. A nice limestone valley, which is a good place to come. So the English moved north, the Germanics really moved north and settled the area. So we have an area of blend here in the northern part of especially Bucks County. And that's where we're sitting today, actually in Northampton County. So what did those first settlers build? Well, they built what they were used to doing. When they came here, there were no stone quarries, there were no stone masons, there were no sawmills, but there were trees. So they cut down the trees and built log buildings. So all the first generation houses and barns were log. Now this is a Germanic log house in the Erie Valley, and it has an interior chimney like the ones we saw back in the Palatinate, which is typical. Log construction. It didn't take much of a technician to build out of log, and besides, the log tradition had already been started by the Swedes who got here before the English in the early 1600s. They also built log barns. So every barn and every house in this area in the 1700s, the middle 1700s, was made of log. Here's a log ground barn like the one we saw in the Palatinate. Central threshing floor, a stable, and a loft above. Simple way to build a barn for a first-generation farmer on the frontier. Now, later on, the Germanics enlarged their barns, and in their model became this. It's a two-level barn, a stable below, and a space above, made of log cribs. One crib here, one section here, threshing floor between, and the all-important overhang or forebay. That is designated a Swiss Germanic origin for this barn. This may have been an early barn built maybe as a first or second generation early frontier barn. Where did it come from? Well, here's an example of it in a high valley in eastern Switzerland. Same thing, log construction, forebay, and a bag on the back of the barn here. So the Germanic settlers, the Pennsylvania Germans, got their model not from the Palatinate. Ultimately, they got it from the part of Switzerland where these barns were invented. And that region is what we're going to see next. This is a valley called Prattigau. It's in eastern Switzerland. That's the Rhine Valley out here. And this has hundreds of barns of log with forebays like this one, which can be dated back to the 1500s. So the idea of the forebay bank barn originated in Switzerland. Many of these people then moved into the Palatinate. Many of them came to Pennsylvania. And when it came time to build larger barns, they used this as their model. But not the Hillers, apparently. But most other farmers in Pennsylvania built a larger example of a forebay barn. When they got money and they got wealth and they wanted to show off, they built a beautiful barn. This is Jerry Boland's barn, built in 1849, I believe. Is that correct, Greg? 1849. And here's his large show barn, but it's a Pennsylvania barn. It has a forebay, this recess to the stable wall. The Hillers didn't do that. They built something different. We don't know why. One reason why is that many of the settlers who came to Pennsylvania with William Penn were Quakers. George Fox in 1647 founded the faith, and he lived in the southern part of the Lake District here in northeastern England. Up here's Scotland, here's England, here's North Yorkshire Dales, and this Red Lake District in England is where many of the people who became Quakers and were then persecuted came to Pennsylvania from. That's a large dome-like mountain structure with peaks that reach up to 3,000 feet. So it's rugged, it's beautiful, it's the prettiest part of England. In fact, it's called the Lake District because those mountains in the Ice Age spawned huge glaciers, which then spilled out toward the sea, and they gouged out valleys as they went. And the closer you were inland, the deeper the valley because the thicker the ice. And then they thinned out. And eventually, when the glacier melted, the rocks that were dropped dammed up the valley, and we have a finger lake. Here's the largest finger lake in the Lake District, Lake Windermere. So this is the landscape of the Lake District. Hilly, mountainous, and lo and behold, I see a barn. There's a pet roof. Don't tell me the Hellers were over there. Anyway, this looks like their barn. And barns like this are common in the Lake District. There are probably 1,000 or more in the general area. And many of them in the southern part, where George Fox first founded his religion, had pent roofs. You can see a pent roof here, just like on our Heller barn. Okay. Most of the early barns in that area were barns of large estates. This is a Dalmain estate. Royalty lived here. They held thousands of acres, and they built the first large bank barns without forebays, English Lake District bank barns. Okay. Here's an example of one from that estate. It's a very tall barn because it's one of the rare double-decker barns in England. It has a ground floor, a stable, a middle level for storage, and an upper level. And if you go to the back of the barn, we can see the bank access. Again, these barns were built in stone. That's very common in the Lake District. It's a mountainous area. The roofs were made of slate, which was also quarried there. So building with stone and slate was common. Let's go into that barn. Here we see a heavy tie beam coming across, and the common rafters, those little guys, and then we have these great big hefty rafters here and here and here. Those are principal rafters, and that principal rafter system then held up these little short sections called purlins, and they held up the common rafters. All barns have common rafters, but they don't all have principal rafters. And you're going to see 3 of these on the tour today, because that idea came to Pennsylvania along with the English settlers. Principal rafter roof system. It's strong and held up slate roof. Here is the Nelson barn on your tour. Again, there's a principal rafter. The common rafter is all over the place. The principal rafter and these little staggered connections called purlins. So the English principal rafter system worked well for slate in England, and it worked well for heavy slate roofs in Pennsylvania, and maybe there's a connection. Here's another English Lake District bank barn. Here's the pent roof, flashing line, you can see that. The pent roof is gone. And the back of the barn shows the bank. So English Lake District bank barns with pent roofs were common all over the Lake District, and especially in the southern part of the Lake District, from whence the Quakers came to Pennsylvania and brought this idea with them. Here's the back end of the barn. In the 1700s, many English farmers, common farmers, began to build bank barns as well. They copied their rich nobles. So here's one of those smaller barns. Here's the back end of another one, which is the bank built onto the barn, just like we do when the land is flat in Pennsylvania. And that barn likewise has a massive principal rafter to hold up the purlins, which hold up the common rafters. Next. And the front of that barn, here's a close-up of a true English Lake District bank barn with a pent roof. Here's the pent roof, which provides protection when going from stable to stable to stable, just like a forebay does in Pennsylvania. So this idea came from England. Here we see the pent roof, the flashing line, the water table, and the pent arms which go back into the foundation, but not back into the barn, and hold up the pent roof. Pent roofs, English Lake District bank barns frequently have wagon sheds, just like the Heller barn. There's a wagon shed. Usually they were open. In the Heller barn's case, it was later closed. We see that tradition. Those barns came to eastern Pennsylvania, in the southern parts of Bucks and Chester County, and many of them survive today. This one is in central Chester County. Here's the original barn, built in 68, Greg? 1769, that's a date story. And here's a flashing line. This barn has a little arched doorway, and across the front, if you can get in there, it's been blocked off, you can see the original pent arms. So this is an English Lake District pent roof barn which came to Chester County. A lot of these are common in the southern part or the Quaker regions of our section here. Later on, the barn was enlarged. They widened it, they made it bigger, and they just expanded the barn because land was cheap, production was good, and they produce good crops. In fact, that idea of a tent roof English barn came north. Here's one outside of Springtown. That's the Funk Barn, which was built around 1820. So although this is a Pennsylvania Dutch or Germanic area, the English ideas did creep north. And here's an example of it. And here's another example of it. Here's a barn that's on Black Creek Road. Actually, it's a house today. But you can see, here was the wagon shed, which is now closed in. Here's the water table for the pent roof. And that barn was originally taller, but they lowered it when they turned it into a house. This may have been the dimensions of the Heller barn when it was still standing. Now, what are the origins of the Heller barn? Well, we know it's an English Lake District bank barn. For whatever reason, Mr. Heller, when he built his show barn around 1790, whatever he had before probably was long, but he built a show barn and a show house. He built a Federal Central Hall house, the Heller house, and he built a large English Lake District bank barn and tent roof. Why he did that, we don't know. Maybe the mason sold him a bill of goods. In any event, the timber framer who put the roof had a different idea. He put up this kind of roof truss, this heavy piece here, almost like a truncated or cut off principal rafter, and these two connections, and then a brace. That is known as a liegender stool roof truss. It means a leaning chair or leaning frame roof truss. And that's certainly not English. Just look at the words there. That is a Germanic roof truss. So the Heller barn's origins are English Lake District bank barn with a Germanic roof truss. That was still intact in the 90s when John McFarland sketched it before the barn came down. So we have a blend. Now the Liegender stool has Germanic origins. It originated in Germany and Switzerland in the mountainous areas of the Black Forest and Northern Alps. And here's an example of a Liegender stool truss in a house in Germany. There's our heavy principal, the brace, and the double ties. These go back to the 1300s. Here's an example of one in a barn in Pennsylvania. This is the Birtlet barn in the Ole Valley, built in 1787. There are probably hundreds of Liegender stool trusses in southeastern Pennsylvania if you include houses and barns. So for some reason, that truss was used on this English Lake District bank barn, which is our Heller barn. And here you can see the original wagon shed. It was enclosed, a stable door was put there, a pent arm was put, and the pent roof was extended at some time during the 1800s. What we're going to do with it? Well, we can build the whole thing or we can rebuild part of it, but presently we have conserved and preserved this corner, and ideas to go on from there would be helpful, so please let us know. Now, I have one final picture coming up here. It's a picture of me taken by my wife Margie in England 15 years ago, and it has some very good advice right there. After you've heard this talk, please read that sign. Thank you very much. We'd like the lights because Greg has to find his talk. It's hidden in his computer somewhere.